10 tribes. All the other 10 tribes would be known from here on out, would be known as Israel. The two tribes, that's the second division in the southern kingdom, would be known as Judah. Now, all of them are Jews. All of them are children of Israel. All of them are descendants of Abraham. All of them are the sons of Jacob, the 12 tribes. But two tribes would be called Judah. Judah's capital city will become Jerusalem. And the capital city for the northern kingdom, which is called Israel, the capital city would be Samaria. So when you will hear this later on, talking about the city of Samaria, this is not another country. This is the city, the capital city of the 12 tribes of Israel. I want that to be understood quite well. The central message in 1 Kings is that division comes through disobedience. And we're going to go through the structure of the book. But the structure of the book, if you would notice, the first 11 chapters of 1 Kings, they're going to deal with the reign and the kingdom of Solomon. The first 11 chapters, chapter 1 through 11, and then chapter 12 through chapter 24 is going to deal with the next 80 years of the two kingdoms. So this is how the book is divided up. And I want to kind of go through chapter by chapter of 1 Kings and kind of give you the idea of what is going on. Now, the reason why I'm doing this, there will probably come a time when I won't be able to go chapter by chapter. But right now, this is a continual flow of history. I don't really have time to really go all the way back, but this is the same children of Israel, the same people, different generations that came out of the land of Egypt, wandered in the wilderness, finally came into Canaan. Then Moses died, Joshua takes over, Joshua dies, then the judges, after the judges, Samuel being the last judge, then they asked for a king. That's how we got the Saul. Saul was the evil king. That's how we got the David. And then David, and we will begin basically the book of 1 Kings. If you would notice, the book of 1 Samuel is mostly involved the kingdom of Saul. The book of 2 Samuel mostly deal with the kingdom of David. So when we come to the book of 1 Kings, we're coming to the end of really David's life and David's reign. In chapter 1 of 1 Kings, David is now old and he has a condition in his body that he's not able to warm himself. He cannot get warm. So they went out and found a young lady by the name of Abishai, that she would be the one to try to warm David's body. He was not sexually active with her, says the word of the Lord, but she was there for that purpose. How many of y'all know that when the king is down, then others will begin to do different things? As David is sick, David's son, Adonijah, decided that I'm going to be made king. And y'all remember Joab is the captain of David's army. Joab goes and make Adonijah king and declares him king along with the priest Abiathar. But this is not the will of God. God had already told David that Solomon would sit on the throne. When Nathan, remember Nathan is a prophet that came to David after he sinned with Bathsheba. Nathan goes to Bathsheba and says to her, David promised you that your son Solomon would be king. David's old, bedridden, and so she goes in and asks David about this. And in chapter 1, David confirms that yes, Solomon is the choice. And then Solomon is then anointed king. This is chapter 1. In chapter 2, of course, at the end of chapter 1, Adonijah, that's the son of David, he flees for his life, because when you set yourself up to be king and you're not there, usually the king that come on the throne will kill the other, because that they are a threat to the kingdom. But he flees, and for now, Adonijah is allowed to live. But Solomon is anointed king. Now, Adonijah didn't know how to look like keep it good while he had it good. And I know these stories take a little while, so I'm going to move on. But Adonijah went to Bathsheba, the mother of Solomon, and asked her, will you go and ask your son Solomon if I can have the woman that David had to warm him? And it angered Solomon. And then Solomon had him put to death. Looked like if he would just kept himself in good place and left that alone, he would have been alive, because he did not kill him because he decided to try to rise up and be the king. Also, some other things were done in the kingdom of Solomon to get rid of some old like things. Joab, the captain of the army for David, who had anointed Adonijah king, was put to death by Solomon's people. Also, y'all remember the man that cursed David and cast up stone, and David let him live? After David's death, Solomon put him to death as well. And so we come to chapter, David dies in 1 Kings chapter 2, chapter 3. Solomon, he makes one of his first missteps, but God is kind of letting him by with this. He marries a daughter of Pharaoh, and this is a bad indication. In chapter 3 is when God appeared to Solomon and says to him, ask me whatever you want. The reason why I go through this chapter by chapter, these good stories in here that you might want to pick out, you want to know where they are. In the 3rd chapter of 1 Kings, and he asked for an understanding heart. And God said, because you didn't ask for the life of your enemy or for riches, God said, I'm going to give you both riches and honor as well. And God did give him this understanding heart. In that same chapter, God demonstrated the fact that he'd given Solomon this wisdom. 2 women that were harlots had children, had babies. One of them, remember this story? One of them had overlaid the child. That child died. She took her child and put the dead child on the other woman, and took the other woman's child, and was brought before Solomon. Solomon got the answer, what do we do with this? Solomon said, bring me a knife. Remember that story? I cut the baby in half. The real mother cried out and said, let her have the baby. And Solomon then said, the one that cried out, that's the real mother. So from then on, it was shown that the wisdom of God was upon the life of Solomon. Chapter 4 tells us more about Solomon and his life. You'll see in chapter 4, verses 32, Solomon spoke 3,000 proverbs and 105 songs. Well, we have the book of Proverbs. If you read the book of Proverbs, it's wise said, one right after the other. We'll get to it. The Song of Solomon, he also wrote. In chapter 5, remember God told David, you can't build the temple, but your son will do it. The beginning of this is chapter 5, a man who was friend with David by the name of Hiram of Tyre. Chapter 5, he will supply the temple with all the timber that's needed to build. And he was a skilled man in this, and that he was able to bring the skilled lumber to the temple and to build the house of God. In chapter 6, chapter 7, you will see that the house of the Lord was built. You can read that. I mean, it was extravagantly built. Almost everything in the temple was overlaid with gold. This is the first time that God would have in the history of Israel a house. Now, remember the tabernacle. They moved it. A tabernacle, the other word for tabernacle is tent. So it was, even though it was by God's specification, It was a tent and was moved. But this is the time that the temple is built. Took 7 years to complete the temple. And you'll see in chapter 6 how he did this, and all the elaborate things, and the gold and the silver and all of the equipment that is in there. Chapter 7, Solomon then built his own house, and he also did build a house for the daughter of Pharaoh that he had married. Solomon also built, so a total of 14 years, 7 years building the Lord's house, I believe in 7 years building his own house. And so then Solomon was fulfilled what God had told him to do. In chapter 8, you'll see the temple is being dedicated, and all of the sacrifices that's being made, and all of this is being done. Chapter 9, you'll see that there is God appears to Solomon again. After Solomon had built the house and dedicated it, God appeared to Solomon again and let him know, if you would just walk in my ways and be obedient, then, I will establish your house. God appeared unto him the first time when he asked him what he wanted. Second time after he dedicated the temple. And God looked like he's trying to remind Solomon to stay where he ought to be. And so God appears to him the second time. And in chapter 9, there are gifts between Solomon and Hiram that had helped him to build the temple. Chapter 10 is very significant because after this building of the great temple and dedication of the temple, then in chapter 10, the Queen of Sheba, y'all remember the Queen of Sheba? She comes from the south. She comes and visit the kingdom of David. She sees the elaborate temple. She sees how well his house is built and his servants and how well they're dressed. And she said, it was told me how great your kingdom was. And she came to test him, to ask him wise questions. And Solomon answered every question. So she saw his wisdom and the splendor of the house of God and his own house. And you remember her saying, she says, there's no more breath left in her. It took her breath. And she said, the half has not been told. But then after all of the glory and the glamour, and this is good for us to remember, and I got to move because we got a piece to go, that when you're blessed and when it goes well with you, is when you have to be careful. Chapter 10, the glorious chapter of the Queen of Sheba. Chapter 11 comes the turning point in the life of Solomon. The Bible would tell us then that Solomon's heart was turned away from God because he loved too many wives. And what he did, these women were not of Israel. So he built gods for all of these women. And so as he did it, he began to worship these idol gods with his wives. Most of the time, who you're married to will affect you. Most of the time. Amen, somebody? And so God was disappointed in Solomon, and God really now says to Solomon, I'm going to bring judgment upon your house. But remember what God promised David. If your sons do evil, I will afflict them. I will punish them, but I will not take the kingdom away. So what God did now comes in. We'll now begin to start dealing with, should I call it the era of the prophets? And you're going to see this more. Notice during Moses, you don't really hear a lot about any of the prophets because Moses himself really was a prophet. During the Judges, you may hear one or two prophets God sent, but it was not in abundance of way. During the time of the kings now, and especially when the kingdoms are going to divide, God looked like brought in the prophets to keep the kings under control. Remember when David sinned? Who did God bring to him? He brought the prophet. He brought Nathan to him. And remember when David also numbered the people? He brought the prophet Gad. So and now God uses a prophet by the name of Ahijah. Ahijah comes and God says, because Solomon, because you've done this, I'm going to take one of your servants. His name is Jeroboam. I'm going to give him a portion of your kingdom. I'm going to take it away, a portion from you. And so the prophet Ahijah, this is what he does, and this is the first 11 chapters. He really rents the garment that was worn by Jeroboam into 12 pieces. He gives Jeroboam 12 pieces of this garment. Says to him, God has said, I have rent the kingdom from the house of David by taking 10 tribes away. The other 2 will go to Judah. And then this basically ends the life of Solomon. Solomon dies in chapter 11. So by the time we get to chapter 12 of 1 Kings, Solomon's son sits on the throne. His son Rehoboam. Rehoboam then becomes Solomon's successor. Now the thing about Rehoboam is he had a chance, and he did go and get counsel from the older men and see what Solomon did and see what you will do. Now, those of you who don't know it, and I didn't go into all the detail, this is in your book, you can read it. Solomon was the richest king of Israel. How does a king get rich? By taxation of the people. That's how he really gets rich. He doesn't really have money himself. By taxation of the people, by taking the things, silver and gold from them. You can read over in Deuteronomy chapter 17, I believe, beginning about verse 14, long in there, 14 through 17. God had told Moses, the people are going to get a king, but tell the king don't get too many horses, don't multiply the horses, don't get too many wives, and don't be excessive and multiply in gold. God predicted this through Moses way before the judges. So you know it was way before the kings. God predicted this, and Solomon broke all 3 of those. He multiplied in horses, had 1,000 women, 700 wives, 300 concubines, and extra silver and gold. So they come to Rehoboam. The children of Israel come to him and says, well, we want to know, your father was hard on us, hard taxation. What will you do? Rehoboam listened to the older men. They said, make it easy on the people. Hear the people. Then he went to those he grew up with, the young guys. They said, make it harder. Said, tell them that compared to you, your father's little finger, you're going to be compared to the whole loin or the waist. In other words, you're going to make it double harder. And when he did this, the 10 tribes of Israel says, then we are going to go our separate way. Jeroboam, who had fled, comes back into Israel. The 12 tribes of Israel now decide, since Rehoboam, the son of Solomon, going to make it even harder on us, we're going with Jeroboam. Now, Jerusalem, the capital city, is in Judah, the 2 tribes. That's where Israel is supposed to go and sacrifice. Now, this is important because this is the turning point, because Jeroboam made his worst sin and the beginning, really, of an evil succession of kings. Because what he did, in order to keep the people, from going back to Jerusalem and thinking that these tribes may, get attached to the kingdom of Judah, he built altars in the part where God had not had him. God's house was in Jerusalem, but he feared the heart of the people would turn back like to Rehoboam. So he built 2 calves, put one in Bethel and one in Dan, and so the people could worship in the land where he was, in the northern kingdom, which is now the capital of Samaria. The Bible says he calls Israel to sin. If you read the book of 1st and 2nd Kings, if you read it, there will be a continual reference back to Jeroboam. This king did evil as Jeroboam did in causing Israel to sin. Jeroboam would be compared. Some would say, he did evil, but not as evil as Jeroboam. Jeroboam would be the one that all the rest of the kings of Israel from here on out pretty much would be compared to, especially the northern kingdom. The southern kingdom would be compared to David. David was like the first king and the good king. So then after this prophet then comes and let him know. So in chapter 13, God sends a man of God to Jeroboam. That is the one that is now, God has said, I gave you 10 tribes, and now you caused them to worship idol gods. And I'm the one through the prophet gave you the 10 tribes. The prophet came and told her these 10 tribes. So God sends a man of God to him and tells him that God is going to cry against the altars of Baal. And Jeroboam reached out his hand against this man of God, and his hand withered. And right there on the spot, when the man of God, of course, prayed, his hand was restored back to him. A very sad thing about this, and I know it's hard for me to tell all these stories in detail. I know I can't get to all of them. But when this man of God did, he was commanded to tell Jeroboam this, leave, don't eat with him, don't drink anything, and leave. He had left and gone back. Another older prophet went and got him and told him to come back and eat bread with him, because he said, I'm a prophet too. That's why you can't listen to everybody who say, yeah, Lord have mercy. And then he came back, and God had told him from the beginning, tell Jeroboam what I said. When Jeroboam reached his hand out, it withered, said, don't eat bread there, leave. This old prophet deceived and convinced him to come back, and a lion met him on his way, and he died. And then that's chapter 14, chapter 15 and 16. We'll see a list of the kings that reign in both kingdoms. As you look at this, saints of God, you would almost have to have photographic memory to remember which king, because what happened is the Bible would say something like, in the 3rd year of the king of Judah, the king of Israel began to reign. And he reigned 13 years. I'm just giving you an example. And then in his 13th year, then such and such began to reign in the king of Judah. So you'll see a back and forth, the reign of the king of Israel and the king of Judah, back and forth. So you have to read this and read each of them specifically. But this is what goes on between chapter 15 and 16, the reign of both kingdoms. There was a total, during this period of time, there was a total of 8 kings in the northern kingdom that did evil. All 8 of them did evil in the sight of God. And 2 kings in the king of Judah. This is the first 80 years now. The first 80 years. And 2 kings of Judah, Asa and Jehoshaphat. And they did good in the eyesight of God. Now, when we come to chapter 16, the ending of chapter 16 comes a man that most of us will remember. Remember King Ahab? The Bible said about King Ahab, if I had time to read it, he became the worst king since Jeroboam. Now, if you read all those chapters, you see several kings came between Jeroboam and Ahab. But God said Ahab caused Israel to sin more than any other king since and beside Jeroboam. I told you they all would be compared to Jeroboam. Now, they got rhyming names. The son of Solomon, Rehoboam. His enemy, or whoever you want to call him, is Jeroboam. They are no kin at all. But now comes Ahab, a descendant that sits up on the kingdom throne, from the kingdom of Jeroboam. Now then comes chapter 17. In the book of 1 Kings, chapter 17, really chapter 17 through chapter 22, you'll find really, it really ought to be called, in a sense, that part of the book of Kings really ought to be called the book of Elijah. Because now, even though it will deal with the king, mostly Ahab and Ahab's sons, but this is going to deal mostly with Elijah. I told you now comes the emergency or the coming forth of the prophets. So in chapter 17, Ahab is an evil king, have done evil more than any of all the kings before. I told you it was up to this point, it's 8 of them. I'll give you the whole total at the end of 2 Kings. But 8 of all of them have done evil. Ahab had done the worst. God brings on the scene Elijah. Chapter 17, Elijah goes to Ahab and tell him it's not going to rain according to my word. 3 years and 6 months. God told him to go down to the brook, remember? And the raven fed him. That's chapter 17. Chapter 17 of 1 King is when we first hear about the prophet Elijah. Remember that was the prophet that rent the garment? His name was Ahijah. I know y'all ain't gonna remember all these names. But this is Elijah. We remember Elijah because he's very popular. Elijah is the one that came and appeared with Jesus on the Mount of Transfiguration. Elijah is really considered as a representative of all of the prophets, even though he did not write a book in his name. But chapter 17 through chapter 22 is mostly dealing with the life and ministry of Elijah. All right. So in chapter 17, after he finished at the brook, he went to the woman. Remember the woman picking up the 2 sticks, the widow woman that's picking up the 2 sticks and getting ready to eat and die. And she brought him first a cake and water, and they ate there for many years. In chapter 18, Elijah goes and finds the governor of the house of King Ahab and say, I need to see your master today. And y'all remember the story. Obadiah said, I fear the Lord. I hear the prophets whenever. Now, there were other prophets along that time, and I'll get to some of that. But Elijah is the one that is one of the focus point at this time. So he said to him, I hear the prophets by 50 and fatter. If I go and tell Ahab that you are here, Elijah, and then God takes you somewhere else, he said, he will have me killed, because he said, there's no nation that they have not such trying to find you, because a drought for 3 years. And so Ahab told him, yes, I will appear. Chapter 18 is that great confrontation between the prophets of Baal, that's Ahab's, and Jezebel. One of the great sins, I hope I mentioned this. If I didn't mention it, I must mention the thing that made Ahab such a great sinner. He married Jezebel, the Zidonian, the wife. He married her, and this was an evil, wicked woman. You'll see as it goes on. So this was one of the main things. And so now, so at Mount Carmel, remember the God that answers by fire. That's 1 Kings chapter 18. I won't go into all the detail. You know that God answered by fire. Elijah had all of them killed, the prophets of Baal, chapter 19. Remember, after Elijah had all them killed, Jezebel sent him a letter and said, I'm going to do the same thing to you by this time tomorrow. And then Elijah went running. Y'all remember Elijah? Discouraged, saying, Lord, let me die, because he had the message from Jezebel. And God said to Elijah, told him to go on the 40-day fast. Remember, God woke him up 2 times, fed him, and said, you will go on the strength of this. But God basically said to Elijah, I'm not through with you yet. At least 3 things you got to do. Lord have mercy, I got to move. You got to anoint the king of Syria, Hazael. You got to anoint a new king of Israel, which is Jehu. And you also got to anoint your successor, Elisha. But he continues on. At this time, Elijah is yet living. Then we go to chapter 20. Chapter 20 is a break in the story really of Elijah. And it becomes now the story that Israel fights. And I guess I don't really open this up by going into more and more detail. Israel going to battle with a king of Syria by the name of Ben-Hadad. Ben-Hadad had warred with Israel. And when he warred with Israel, he had what he called was princes over so many. And he lost the battle with Israel. He said, well, we're going to rename ours captains instead of princes. And Israel won because their God is a God of the hills. If we fight them in the plain, in the valley, we will defeat them. But God gave Israel the victory again against Syria in the plain, not because Ahab was a good king, but because God said, I want my name to be known among the heathen, that I'm not a God of just the hills, I'm a God of all. Then what happened after God defeated, God defeated this army, God defeated them that fought against Israel. Then what Ahab did, he let Ben-Hadad be brought into his kingdom, the man he just got through fighting, and let him go. In those times, you had to kill the enemy. A prophet came to Ahab, dressed, disfigured, and told him a story that a man had someone delivered to him, said, if you let him go, it'll be your life, his life. And then Ahab said, well, you made your own decision, and then he unveiled himself. It was known that he was one of the sons of the prophet. And he said to Ahab, that's what God is saying to you. You let Ben-Hadad go, and you should have killed him while you had him. And now it's going to be your life for his life. Now, this is a prophecy of God against Ahab that he's going to die. This is that prophecy. And so Ahab, of course, is all sad and disappointed with that, but he did not really learn his lesson. That's chapter 20. Chapter 21, and I'm getting close because chapter 22 is the last chapter of 1 Kings. And then we go to 2 Kings. So chapter 22, Ahab, he lives beside, or his kingdom is beside, a man's garden by the name of Naaman. Remember that story? Come on, Bible students. Naaman had a vineyard, and he loved the way it looked. And he told him, look, I want your vineyard. I'll pay you money for it. Naaman said, no. You may be the king, but this is my inheritance, and it's not legal for me to give away. I will not do it. And he went home, wouldn't eat, sobbing. Jezebel basically come up there and said, man, what's wrong with you? Can I put it in our language? You're the king. You sobbing over something. I'll take care of it. Go on, eat. That's the kind of woman she was. And she sent letters to have Naaman falsely accused and Naaman to be stoned and put to death in the city where he was. And so Ahab jumps up and Jezebel tells him, all right, it's taken care of. Go on down there and get the vineyard. It's yours. And while he was getting ready to go there, God spoke to Ahab, said, go meet him. Ain't that something? And he comes up in there ready to take the vineyard, and there's Ahab. He's like, oh my God, there's Elijah. Ahab said, there's Elijah. And Ahab's telling, God said, because you killed this innocent man, you're going to die as well. And the dogs will lick your blood in the city called Jezreel. And Jezebel, the one who instigated, the dogs are going to eat her. And I don't have time to get in that story. I'll probably tell you what chapter happened in. But they had gone, and Jezebel was like thrown over a wall, and they were going to go back and perhaps like burial. When they came back, it was nothing left of them. That's how much anger God had with them. So this is the judgment against King Ahab. And so now chapter 22, there's a story, the king of Judah, his name is Jehoshaphat. He comes down to visit Ahab, and Ahab decides there's a city that belonged to us that we need to take it back. And Jehoshaphat said, well, my people are your people. We're the same nation. We just separated now. It's two different nations. So we'll go but inquire of the Lord, should we go and do this? 400 of the prophets of Ahab said, go up, God will give you the victory. Now, this prophet in this last chapter is not Elijah, but a prophet by the name of Micaiah. Y'all remember him? I hope y'all can remember some of these stories. And so they said, Jehoshaphat said, it looked like in his mind, wait a minute, this sounds too good to be true. 400 prophets, all of them say go up. Now, Ahab just went his own way. Jehoshaphat, is there not another prophet? Ahab says, one more prophet. His name is Micaiah, but I hate him. He'll never prophesy good to me. Y'all remember that story? And the reason why he don't prophesy good, because Ahab didn't do anything good. How you going to prophesy good and you don't do good? And Jehoshaphat, the king of Judah, said, don't say that. And so and let's go get him. They went and got him, and the man that we got him said, now you prophesy just like all the rest of them. They all said good. They said go up. And Micaiah said, whatever the Lord said, I said. When they first brought him there, he said, go up. You'll prosper. And even Ahab said, you know, how many times I command you to tell me the truth? And Ahab said, then Micaiah says, I saw Israel as sheep without a shepherd. That means Ahab, you're going to die. Elijah had already prophesied it. Now the prophesied Micaiah is really in conjunction. When there are real true prophets, they will not cross each other in what God said. Because the same God talked to both prophets. Are y'all with me? Something funny if God tell, I better not mess with that. Yeah, but Elijah had already told him he was going to die. Now come Micaiah. Micaiah said, I saw Israel as sheep without a shepherd. And he got upset with him. One of the men came and slapped him. And then they said, put him in prison. Feed him with the bread of affliction and water till I come back. Micaiah said, if you come back, King Ahab, let all Israel know that I am a false prophet. What happened? Y'all know the story. What Ahab did, he disguised himself. Lord, I don't have time to tell all this stuff. Ahab disguised himself, but had Jehoshaphat, the king of Judah, with his royal robe on. So in the war, Jehoshaphat looks like the king, Ahab is disguised. So they come upon Jehoshaphat, and Jehoshaphat screams out, and they realize that's not the one we want. We're commanded to go after nobody but Ahab. And inadvertently, an arrow hit him. Do y'all see when God says something is going to happen? Micaiah, Lord have mercy, these stories are good. I wish I could tell them all. Micaiah said what happened is it was a meeting in heaven, and God said, how can I get Ahab up to battle? Because I'm going to kill him because I told him he was going to die. So God said, the way I'm going to do it, one angel came to God and said, Lord, this is how I can do it. I'll be a lying spirit in the mouth of those prophets. And that's what that angel did, became a lying spirit and convinced him to go up. And there, when arrow hit him, he bled in his chariot, and then later on, he died. They washed his blood out in the city of Jezreel, just like the prophet Elijah said. And what? The dogs came and licked his blood. God is true. All right, that's the end, really, of Ahab, and that's really the end of First Kings. Second Kings, Lord have mercy, Jesus. The Second Kings, in the book of Second Kings, we will now come to the time when the kingdom will come to an end. Both of them. By the end of 2 Kings, Judah, the 2 tribes of the south, and the 10 tribes Israel of the north will be totally taken out of the land. Because God promised way back with Moses, if you sin and do I'll take you out of the good land. Y'all remember him saying that? I'll take you out of the good land that I gave to you. This is the same land of Canaan that Joshua went and conquered. God said, I'll take you out. Now, let me kind of move on. In chapter, first of all, in chapter 1 of 2 Kings, the son of Ahab is now in power. Because Ahab died, remember. His son, Ahaziah is his son. And he's fallen and gotten sick from the fall. And he wants to know, am I going to get well? Instead of going to Elijah, the old man Elijah, still the prophet, he goes to the god of Beelzebub of Ekron. And before he gets there, Elijah again intercepts him and said, go back and tell your master, yes, he's going to die. Because you act as if that God is not a God in Israel. You go into an idol god of another nation to get your reference. And then the king that had sent them to ask him if he was going to get well, he sent 50 men, because Elijah, after he told them this, he went on top of a mountain. And they went, and the 50 men said, they told him to come down from the mountain. And Elijah said, if I be a man of God, let fire come down upon. And those 50 men and their captain died by fire. He sent 50 more. Same thing happened. That third 50 group, he basically said to Elijah, look, please don't kill us. The king wants you to come. Will you please come? The other 50 died. The second 50 died. So God told him, don't kill these. Go on down with it. And he prophesied. In other words, what I want to let you know, God was not through with Elijah yet. Remember, Elijah would thought he was ending it when Jezebel sent the letter. He had more prophesying to do. He prophesied to Ahab about Nabal's garden. He also prophesied to his son that he would not live. So we come to chapter 2. Everybody remember chapter 2 in 2 Kings, right? Elijah, this is the end of the great prophet Elijah. Because this is when Elisha follows Elijah. Remember chapter 2? He went to Bethel, he went to Jordan, he went to Bethel, he went to Jericho, he went to all those different cities, and he continued, and he finally asked him, what do you want me to do for you? And Elisha said to Elijah, I want a double portion of your spirit. That's chapter 2, 2 Kings. And so he says, if you be there present, when I'm taken up, it will happen. The mantle fell. Elisha now becomes the prophet of focus. So at the end of 2 Kings chapter 17 through 22, and even over into first chapter of 2 Kings, is the ministry of Elijah. Starting with chapter 2 is the ministry of Elisha. All right? So now we look at the ministry of Elisha. Oh, I don't have time to tell all these stories, Lord have mercy. But in chapter 3, there's a happening with the son. That king's son, Asahiah, died, and Jehoram, then his son was on the king. And there was a war of the Moabite decided to fight against Saul's grandson, Ahab's grandson, because, he would not pay the same tribute to him as he did Saul. So they went up to battle. Jehoshaphat went with him, and also the king of Edom, those three kings. This is the time when they went out into the desert area and they didn't have any water. And they went and inquired from the prophet Elisha, what shall we do? And after he brought him the minstrel and the music, said, God said this, go dig the ditches. Y'all remember that story? There will be no wind, there'll be no rain, but there will be water in the ditches. And so God worked this miracle through Elisha. According to my understanding of study, Elisha asked for a double portion of Elijah's spirit. If I make no mistake, Elijah did 17 miracles. Elisha did 34. And so God granted him this. That's chapter 3. That's one I tell somebody certain things. When I get to heaven, I want to ask if they allow me. How did God send water with no rain, no wind, and it wasn't no sea? Isn't that amazing? But God did that under the miracle of him. Chapter 4, other miracles of Elisha. Also, I didn't tell y'all, when Elisha was anointed, remember those children that came out and mocked him? 42 of them were killed by she-bears, which says it's dangerous to really, make light of God's anointing. That's back in chapter 2. We're up to chapter 4. The widows two sons are threatening to be taken away. This is the story why she said, what she cries out to Elisha, what should I do? Go your house with pots. Don't put anything in them, just borrow them, and then start to pour it. That great story is in chapter 4 of 2 Kings. And at the end of chapter 4, we find the Shunammite woman. Remember the woman that built a house for Elisha? When he came by, he passed by so many times. So she built a little room and gave him a place, a lamp, a place to study and relax. And he told her she would have a son, which she did. But later on, the son died. But also God used Elisha to resurrect that son. All of that happened in chapter 4. Chapter 5, remember Naaman was a great captain of the god of the Syrian army, but he was a leper. But a little girl was taken from Israel during one of the battles of Syria against Israel. She was taken as a maid, and she said to her mistress, I would to God that my Lord, the person that she was her master, was in Israel, because he could be made cured. So in chapter 5, Naaman comes to the king of Israel, and he don't know what to do. He's an ungodly king, though he's on the throne. And then, so Elisha said, tell him to come to me. And y'all remember the story, he told him, go wash 7 times in Jordan. He was made whole. Chapter 6, Elisha then throws the stick into the water and calls a head of an axe to swim. That's another one of the miracles to do. At the end of chapter 6, and I'm trying to move y'all, and I know I'm going to have to go just a little bit over so I can finish this. But at the end of chapter 6, God was revealing, the Syrians were getting ready to fight against Israel. But God would reveal to Elisha where they were going to be and their plan of action. And then he would tell it to the king of Israel. And the king of Israel would be prepared. So the king of Syria said, I'm going to make this, meeting and find out who is it against me in my own kingdom. One of his men says, none of us. But God's revealing it to Elisha, what you do in your secret bedroom, in your closet. God's revealing it, and therefore this is what happened. So he sends this band of people to go and to capture Elisha, and God sends a whole legions of angels that his servant Elisha cannot see in the air. And then when they came out to come against Elisha, he prayed that God would smite them with blindness, and they were brought to the house of the Lord. In chapter 7, remember the story of the lepers. At the end of chapter 6, when Samaria, they besieged again, they besieged the people of Israel. To besiege means that they encamped them and didn't allow them to go in or come out, so they could not have the proper food. It became so bad, the end of chapter 6, that's 2 Kings chapter 6, these two women decide each of them was going to kill and eat their own baby. One of them did it, and the other one was planning on doing it. And Elisha told them, as they came and got him, the king is upset with Elisha, not Elijah, but Elisha now. But he told them, by this time tomorrow, in the gate in the morning, the gate will be filled with food. And so chapter 7 is the story, and I'm getting close, y'all. In chapter 7, there's the story of these 4 lepers that's outside of Samaria. Samaria is the capital of Israel, right? The northern kingdom. And they said, if we go back in there, we're going to die. So they went to the camp of the Syrians, and there God had done a very special thing and caused their feet to be magnified. And they heard armies coming. They ran and left food and garments and left everything, silver, gold, and Israel was able to do this, and God worked a miracle. In chapter 8, I'm just hitting bits and pieces now. That same Shunammite woman that helped Elisha out, and he raised a son, that was a famine, and she had to leave her land. And when she got ready to come back, they didn't really want her to have her land back, so she abandoned it. But Elisha was able, and one of the servants that knew it was able to say, this is the woman that helped the prophet Elisha, and she was able to get her land back. This goes to show you that when you have done something favorably, And I know people don't like you to say it, for a man of God, God will remember it because that's who God had anointed. And she helped God's anointed man, and she was able to have her land back restored. In chapter 9 of 2 Kings, it comes to pass. I don't have time to go through all the story, but Jezebel is eaten. It does come to pass by those dogs. Chapter 10, Jehu, who was anointed king over Israel, he destroys all of the sons of Ahab, because Ahab, God said, I will get rid of your posterity. You will not have another son. Eventually, I'll get rid of all of your lineage because of the sin you did. Now, he had 2 or 3 sons to come after him, but then all of his sons were killed. All right? Because when God says something, he will do it. Now, the last chapter 11 through chapter 17, it is alternating events between both of the 2 kingdoms. And in these alternating times is when we will find the end of both kingdoms. I'm coming close, y'all. But there's a chapter 11 that's very important. When one of these, the son of this woman by the name of Athaliah, chapter 11, her son was killed. What she did, she rose up and killed all of the rest of her sons and all of her grandsons. Athaliah, you may not hear much about it. So she tried to get rid of all of the royal seed of David. But don't you remember God said, I will not destroy the kingdom and the lineage and family of David. There was one son that she didn't see or wasn't aware of. And he was just, I believe, 2 years old, if I make no mistake, as in chapter 11. And he was maybe 1 or 2 years old. But his aunt had hid him away from all the rest of them that were slaughtered. Hid him in the temple. So this evil woman that killed all these others, and when that little boy became 7, the priests, they got together and they sound the trumpet and they declared him king in the temple. Athaliah was in the temple, and she realized, what are they doing? She was a queen rather, in Israel for a short period of time. Some of y'all may not know that Israel ever had a queen, but she really was. But not by the will of God. So God said the seed of David would sit on the throne after him, not this lady. And so when they anointed this boy that was left, that is of the lineage of David, one of the great way on down there, sons of David, when they anointed him king, she cried out, treason, treason. And remember that story? Some of you may not remember, but she was taken outside the temple and killed. That happened in chapter 11. Chapter 12, 13, you'll find different occasions of different, this king did even in the sight of the Lord, and not much detail. Chapter 13 of 2 Kings, Elisha died. And there was one more miracle left for Elisha. There was a Moabite person that died. Elisha was dead and in the pit. And when they threw this man's body in the pit, when they touched Elisha's body, that man came back alive again. Chapters 14 through 17, you'll find a lot of different kings. It's not a lot of significance. This king was the son of this one. He did even in the sight of God, in the sight of all. And then we come down to the last 18 to 25 chapter. Chapter 17. Mark this. In chapter 17, and y'all can really find it in your study. In chapter 17 marks the end of the northern kingdom. They are gone by chapter 17. They are carried away, and I'm going to touch upon a little bit of this. They are carried away, never really to return back as a nation. I'll go down and tell you ahead of time and then lead up to it. Just give me about 5 or 10 more, maybe I can finish this. The kingdom of Judah, God will not destroy because of his promise. The promise he made David goes all the way back through the promise of Abraham. So even though Judah will be carried into Babylon, they will be brought back from Babylon and back to their land of Jerusalem. And that kingdom will never end because Jesus is the son of David. And he was set up on the throne of David. And he did that in a spiritual way when he came on the earth the first time. He will come back again and literally sit on the throne of David and reign upon the earth during the millennium. Now that's way down the line. But I just want you to see that God is a promise keeper. From chapter 18 on, and I will do this quickly, then comes Hezekiah, chapter 18. Hezekiah is known as the best king that Israel had. And really, when I look at it and study it, y'all, even better than David. I may be saying a mouthful. Because God said there was not a king better than him before him or after. God put a bright spot at the end. Israel is on their way. Israel is already now gone as a nation. Judah is soon to be totally carried away into Babylon. But God put a bright spot, Hezekiah, and God blessed Hezekiah. The Bible said he did. If y'all read the book of Kings, you'll say this king did good in the sight of God, but he did not get rid of the grove. He did not get rid of the high places. If y'all read that, you had to come across that several times. And this king did good in the sight of God, but he did not get rid of the grove. That was continually a flaw in the life of Israel. God seemed to kind of let them by a little bit because the high places could be a worship place of God, but they were worshiping wrong, and many of them did not get rid of high. But Hezekiah got rid of the high place. Guess what's up there on the high place? Y'all remember that brazen serpent in the wilderness that Moses lifted up? They call it Nehushtan. They gave it a name. They were really reverencing that thing. Hezekiah got rid of it. No king like him turned their hearts towards God. There's one other bright spot king that will come later on. In chapter 19, Syria comes against Israel, Judah. When Hezekiah is king, God said to tell the prophet Isaiah, go back and tell him you ain't gonna have to do anything, but God is going to do this. And so what God did, he sent an angel, killed 185,000 of the Syrians in one night. Chapter 20, remember this chapter? Hezekiah got sick unto death. And Isaiah came to him and said, you're going to die, Hezekiah. Get your house in order. Hezekiah turned his face to the wall. God gave him 15 more extra years. That's in chapter 21. After Hezekiah, then eventually he did die after those 15 years. Chapter 21, y'all. Did I tell y'all Hezekiah was the best king? That's Judah now. Remember the northern kingdom, the 12, they already have been carried away into distant land. Hezekiah was the best. After him, his son Manasseh becomes the worst of all the kings of Judah. That's amazing to me. How can you see your daddy do all this good? And this man, I can't even tell y'all, he worshiped the moon and sun, the familiar spirit, and let his children go through the fire. He put idol gods in the temple, not just in Israel, in the temple itself. He caused Israel to sin so much and so until, if you continue to read this on about the history of Judah, it says God will take Judah, destroy Jerusalem because of the sins of Manasseh. Manasseh did worse than any other king before him. And I got to move on. After Manasseh, there was another king in there after him that lived a little short period of time, I think maybe a few months, a few years. Then come the next best king, Josiah. Remember Josiah at age 8 became king, and as he was going to repair the temple of the Lord, they found the book of the Lord. And when they found the book of the Lord and he saw all the law and what they supposed to have been doing, notice all the time I've been talking about all these kings. Have anybody said anything about any feasts? Have anybody said anything about the Passover? They have totally forgotten what Moses had done. As a nation, but he sent the scribe. The scribe had the book, and they read in it. And when he hears this, he tears his clothes, humbles himself before God, send to the prophet Huldah. So what's going to be? What's the situation? The prophetess Huldah says, God says yes because of the nation. It is going to be destroyed. But Josiah, because you humble yourself, it will not happen in your day. God will let you die and rest in peace. And this will happen after you. Josiah had the temple repaired, some things repaired and done to the temple. And also he reinstituted chapter 21, chapter 22. He had the book of the law read. He also had the people to renew the covenant with God. He destroyed the idols that Manasseh made back. Remember all them idols of the grove and all that Hezekiah got rid of? Manasseh went back and redid all of that. And now the grandson, Josiah, and I think actually he's the grandson of Manasseh, but the great-grandson, I believe I'm right, of Hezekiah. He go and tear all this stuff down again and cause Israel to come back to a time. Kept the Passover. This had not been done for many, many years. And then in chapter 24 and 25, you have several other evil kings. And I want to read this, y'all. This is the end. After the kings have done evil, then comes the end. In the book of 2 Kings, chapter 20, let me read a little bit of chapter 24. This is what happened, verse 11. I'm quickly, y'all. I'm just about through. And Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, came against the city, and his servants did besiege it. And Jehoiakim, the king of Judah, went out to the king of Babylon, he and his mother and his servants and his princes and his officers. And the king of Babylon took him and all in the 8th year of his reign. And he carried out from thence all the treasures of the house of the Lord and the treasures of the king's house, and cut into pieces all the vessels of gold that Solomon, the king of Israel, had made. I will not read all of this, but in 2 Kings chapter 24 becomes the end of the second kingdom of Judah, the end of it all. No longer Israel as a nation in their own land. Go to chapter 25, and he burnt the house of the Lord and the king's house that's in Jerusalem, and all of the mighty great men, he burned all of their houses. Remember how I told you in 1 Kings, the elaborate building that Solomon built, how he had wood shipped in, that wonderful temple was burnt because of sin, because of ungodliness. That's the end of Israel. Let me give you a quick little briefing. Overall, in the book of Kings, there were 19 kings in all that reigned in Israel, the northern kingdom. That's the 10 tribes. That kingdom lasts for 250 years. When they separated, and Jeroboam lasted 250 years. Now, the 19 kings came from 7 different families. The northern kingdom was not promised that their descendants would sit on the throne. So a different family, a different group, some of them were descended of those, but they came from at least 7 different families. The tribe of Judah is a tribe that has David's promise. All of the kings of Judah, and there were 20 kings of Judah, their kingdom lasts 140 years longer than the northern kingdom. The kingdom of Judah lasts 390 years. 390 years. All of its kings came from the family of David. That one woman, Athaliah, that made herself queen is not counted, though she did do what she did. So now, when you look at this, and y'all can read this for yourself, 47 in the book, you'll see during these last part of the kings of Israel, these prophets are named. Some of them were prophets to the northern kingdom. During the time, the part of the Assyrian captivity, you'll see who was there that prophesied to the northern kingdom. You'll see who prophesied during the time, like I said, this part ends with the captivity of Judah in Babylon, which time you see Obadiah, Joel, Isaiah, Micah, Nahum, Habakkuk, Zephaniah, all of them, and Jeremiah had prophesied to Judah before they went down to Babylon. The prophets that prophesied after the captivity was Ezekiel, Daniel, Haggai, Zechariah, Malachi. Why is that important? These prophets prophesied during the kings, during the time of the kings, but you don't see, only ones you hear are Ahijah, Elijah, Elisha, and Micaiah. But all these other prophets were prophesying during those times. And we are talking about them when we get to their books. So when we get to their book, and you would notice that they were prophets of Judah, you'll know that they prophesied to the southern kingdom of David's descendant. If they prophesied to the northern kingdom, that means the one that came from under Jeroboam, that divided into the second group. I hope you are understanding this and not getting confused, but God bless. Thank you for listening. That concludes the book of Kings. Now, the book of Chronicles, in a review, it will kind of overlap some of the life of David again. It is somewhat of a review of most of the life of David. But make no mistake, as you read Chronicles, you have a bunch of listening of names, but it will only deal with the kingdom of Judah, not the northern kingdom. God bless you. Thank you for listening. I hope that I have not crammed your head too much, but I hope that I've given you enough knit bits and pieces so you'll know where to go back to find it. This is a continual story from the time of the children of Israel all the way out of Egypt, all the way in the wilderness, all the way to Joshua bring them into Canaan, the period of the judges, the end of the judges that asked for a king, the three kings that sat on the united kingdom, then the kings in the divided kingdom, until both kingdoms were dispersed and taken out of their land. That is the complete story of Israel up until this point. The name of this study is Through the Bible. So I'm trying to get y'all to see how it's connected, and we're going through it. All right? God bless you. Thank you for listening. Those of you, if you're blessed by this, share with us, those who are watching us live, and be a blessing to this work in ministry. You can do that by going to Givelify and give. If you're being blessed and this information is blessing your life, then give. You can also not only go to Givelify and see Emmanuel there, but you can do it by Cash App, which is $ECOGIC 1208. They also do it by way of PayPal. You can give ECOGIC@outlook.com. Also, you can just mail it in to Emmanuel Church of God in Christ, P.O. Box 7145, Tupelo, Mississippi, 38802. May the Lord bless you and keep you. Until next time, we'll continue to study. Now, those of you who are following me, I think I'll be able to be here next week with 1st and 2nd Chronicles. We'll have a few meetings, and I might have to miss some district meetings and so forth. May end up missing a couple of weeks, but we're coming back. I think next week I'll get 1st and 2nd Chronicles, and then by that time we'll be ready to go. Maybe after a couple of weeks or so, break into the next books, Ezra, Nehemiah. Those are the ones after exile. Hang with us as the story of Israel continues. God bless you real good. Until then, remember, he that has begun a good work in you, he will perform it to the day of Jesus Christ. God bless you, is our prayer.